Welcome to the Sports Science Dudes. I'm your host, Dr. Jose Antonio, with my co-host, Dr. Tony Ricci. You can find our podcast on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts. So make sure when you go on YouTube, hit the like button, like our show. Our special guest today is Dr. Cienfuegos. She's a clinical assistant professor. I think you're still assistant. Are you associate yet?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. Well, eventually you will be. In kinesiology and nutrition at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Dr. Cienfuegos has a Ph.D. in human nutrition, has been studying intermittent fasting for the last 7 years. She's an emerging expert in the field with more than 30 pubs in the most prestigious journals. It's quite impressive here. You're published in Cell, Annual Reviews, and Nature. That's pretty badass. You've also participated in several national and international scientific conferences and trained other professionals worldwide. You currently are a co-investigator on 2 R01s, examining the health benefits of fasting. So, first of all, Sofia, welcome to the show.
I'm excited to be here.
Did some research into where you're from. You're from Chile.
I'm from Chile. Yes, South America.
Which is one of those countries. And as a young kid, I was kind of a nerd. I would look at a globe and I would be like, I want to go here. I want to go there. And when I saw Chile, I'm like, wow, this is a really long country. And I didn't realize how long it was till I looked it up today. It is long. It goes from the bottom of California all the way to the Northwest Territories of Canada. I'm thinking, that's long. That's crazy. Yeah. So it's like, oh, it's a thin country. No, it's a long country. So this has nothing to do with science, but I'm curious. If you go from the northernmost tip of Chile to the southernmost tip, I assume the northernmost tip is tropical and the southernmost tip is cold? No?
No. So actually, the north part of Chile is usually, it's like a desert. It's like the Atacama Desert. So it's super dry, very hot, very dry, like not non-tropical at all. It's
wow.
Desert. There's like a lot of minings and then the south is Patagonia. So I don't know if you've heard of Patagonia logo.
Yes.
So the south is very cold, but it's also really beautiful, mountains, forests. It's gorgeous. I honestly am biased and I really like the south. The north, I mean, it's beautiful as well, but the south is, if you ever go to Chile, go to the south. It's
So the cold winters in Chicago, you're used to.
I'm from Santiago. I'm from the middle. And in the middle, in Santiago, our weather is exactly the same as in California. We have Mediterranean weather. So it's like, kind of like we have a little bit more seasons than California, but it's very mild. It's like, so the Chicago winters are definitely rough for me. But I'm used to them now.
Yeah, Chicago's rough for everybody. I would tell you that. So
it's rough, but I love it. I honestly love it here. I'm happy.
Now you've been there not quite a decade, right? At the University of Chicago?
8 years now.
8 years.
Not a decade yet.
Yeah, and you're gonna stay there, get tenure, and just who knows?
We'll see. Who knows? After the pandemic, you cannot plan that much. You never know what's gonna happen. It's like your plans can be, I don't know what's gonna happen. But yeah.
Well, first of all, thanks for being on the show. And I think what prompted me to get you on the show is obviously intermittent fasting is a hot topic, particularly, and Tony and I come from an exercise performance athlete background. And so I tend to view IF from that lens versus looking at health and body comp and whatnot, but still all of that's important. But when you gave a online seminar for us way back when, and this is sort of jumping the gun to get to some details, but we'll get to some of the generalities later. You published a really elegant study comparing 4-hour and 6-hour time-restricted feeding. Now, before I go further with some of the specific data, on social media, people use different terminology for what can be best described as you're not eating. Okay, so we have intermittent fasting, we have time-restricted feeding, and even within the IF world, some people have different definitions for intermittent fasting. If you skip breakfast, that's intermittent fasting. If you skip dinner, it's intermittent fasting. So is there an accepted global definition for it? And if not, that's fine too, as long as we know what we're talking about. And compare IF to time-restricted feeding, because I know you use time-restricted feeding in that study.
Yeah, so yeah, that's a really good question. We don't have a very universal consensus yet. However, what everybody doing research in intermittent fasting agrees on is that intermittent fasting is sort of like an umbrella term for the different types of strategies that would be considered intermittent fasting. So you have time restricted feeding, like you said. We usually now call it time restricted eating, because feeding was called when we were moving from animal studies to human studies. And then in human studies, we usually call it now is time restricted eating, because you feed the animal, but humans eat. So that's why now it's time restricted eating.
Okay.
Yeah, so time restricted eating is the most common one, the one that people kind of associate with intermittent fasting the most, where you shorten the amount of hours that you eat each day. So that could be either skipping breakfast or skipping dinner, however you prefer, but you eat on less hours than you usually eat. So you eat on an 8-hour window or a 6-hour window or a 10-hour window, you choose. And that's the type of intermittent fasting that we've been studying. But there are some other types of intermittent fasting. Another one is called alternate day fasting, where you alternate one day of eating normal and one day of fasting. The other day you eat normal, the other day you fast. And that fast could be a complete fast, so like 0 calories, or it could be like a very low calorie diet, like 500 or 600 calories. There's another one that's called the 5-2 diet, where it's very similar, but you fast for 2 days a week. Those could be like consecutive or non-consecutive days, and then the remaining 5 days you eat normal. And then the last one is the fasting mimicking diet. I don't know if you've heard of the fasting mimicking diet. It's kind of getting popular. It's the main researcher in fasting mimicking diets, Dr. Walter Longo. And it's basically a diet that you eat, but you eat very low calories, very low protein, and it's basically like a plant-based diet that mimics what happens during fasting. So it's actually very low protein, and it's, I don't know if you've seen Prolon.
No.
Those products where it's so you do it 5 days a month, and basically it's like as if your body would have been fasting for 5 days. I've never done it, but it's a little bit popular, I would say. But definitely the most popular one is time restricted eating.
Do you yourself engage in time restricted eating?
I do. There's some periods of my life where I do it more like strictly and consciously, and some other periods, but I would consider myself as someone that kind of naturally fasts, but that's not exactly the same as doing intermittent fasting. But still, I naturally kind of start eating later in the day. So for me, whenever I really want to like do intermittent fasting, it's not that difficult for me. But still, I am someone that struggles. I struggle with eating enough protein. So for me, sometimes fasting is not the best strategy because it's a little bit difficult for me to eat enough protein.
Yeah, you know what's interesting, and Tony, we're a bit older than you, Sophia, so we were part of the generation where it was hammered, and even in grade schools, like we were told breakfast is the most important meal of the day. Make sure you don't skip breakfast. And ironically, most people are just not hungry at breakfast. I mean, I'm not hungry, but in a way, I avoid it by just working out, and then I have a protein shake or something after I work out. But I'm not hungry in breakfast. But that point was always hammered home. And then I don't know when data on fasting started to come out, and then I was sitting there and I realized, wait a minute. So all these people who are skipping breakfast, they were basically intermittently fasting without calling it intermittently fasting. They just said, I'm not hungry, so I'm not eating. And I always thought, well, what a great way to not gain weight. You're just basically skipping one of the meals out of, most people eat 3 meals. So Tony, I don't know if you remember in grade school where it was like, gotta eat breakfast, most important meal of the day.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, we didn't want to leave the house without putting something in us for sure. Yep.
So the question is it really the most important meal of the day?
That's a really, really complicated question, and there's been a lot of like debate about that lately in like the intermittent fasting world. Because okay, so it's tricky because some people consider breakfast skipping as the same as intermittent fasting, and not necessarily. You could be fasting and doing intermittent fasting and having breakfast as well. So maybe you have breakfast and you finish eating a little bit earlier. The thing with breakfast skipping is that usually breakfast, one thing is like, we don't really know what breakfast is. There's not like a universal like definition of breakfast. So all the data on breakfast skipping, we're not really sure what people are considering breakfast. This is because of the time. If you eat it between 6 a.m. and 10 a.m., that would be breakfast, or is it the types of foods that you're consuming there? So that's a little bit like, I don't know, not very clear. And also breakfast skipping is related to many unhealthy habits. So usually breakfast skipper are people that go to bed really late and wake up really late as well, people that drink alcohol, people that smoke. So usually breakfast skipping is linked to other unhealthy things. So when you look at the population in general, and you look at people that skip breakfast, they have worse health outcomes in general, right? But we don't really know if it's because they're skipping breakfast or because of the many other variables that are related to someone that is not having breakfast. People that have breakfast usually are from more stable houses, higher socioeconomic levels, more organized, healthier lifestyles, exercise, other things. So I wouldn't say that breakfast is the most important meal a day. However, it's definitely better if you're going to fast, if you're going to do intermittent fasting, at least from my point of view, it's better to do your eating window earlier in the day. So to have breakfast and have lunch and finish eating earlier than to skip breakfast and like have lunch and dinner and doing your eating window kind of late in the day. Definitely doing it earlier is better. So I wouldn't say that there's one meal that's the most important one, but eating earlier in the day, I would consider it better or healthier. I don't know if that made any sense. Hopefully it wasn't confusing.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I have actually done it the reverse way that you said, Dr. Sofia, which I went to an experiment for about 6 months when I lived in Texas, where I finished eating about 4:30 every day. And it was challenging. I'll say that. I went to bed real hungry and I could not wait to get up, but it definitely hit my lowest percentage of body fat. I'll tell you that much. But I do have one question that follows on that one. In terms of, independent of whether we call it, time restricted eating, what is the minimum? Is there a minimum duration we have to be without food in hours in order for it to qualify? So maybe just 8-hour regular fast, obviously, from sleeping is not enough. Do we know if there's a minimum window that would help qualify under any nomenclature, independent of what we call it?
That's a really good question. So studies have usually looked at the time for glycogen depletion to determine when like the fasting metabolism kind of starts. So the point where your glycogen stores are depleted and you have to start using fat, right? That's the point where you say, okay, the fasting kind of metabolic state is starting to take action. And that depends a lot on body size, right? So glycogen stores are mainly in the liver and the muscle. So I don't know, 100-pound female probably in like 8 or 9 hours could start burning fat because her glycogen stores are probably already depleted. But I don't know, a 250-pound weightlifter male, probably those glycogen stores last for way longer because of the amount of muscle and liver mass in general. But there is like, in general, people say that is around 12 hours. So usually the threshold is 12 hours. So if you're fasting for at least 12 hours or more, that would be considered intermittent fasting. If you're fasting for more than like 24 to 30 hours, that wouldn't technically be considered intermittent fasting. That would be considered prolonged fasting. And actually the metabolic behavior of that is also kind of different. So it's anywhere between 12 and kind of 30 hours. That's the spot for intermittent fasting.
Great.
Could you comment real quickly on religious or fasting or Ramadan fasting, how that is or is not different than sort of the traditional intermittent fast?
Yeah. So actually, many of the data that we had prior to starting doing research on intermittent fasting came from Ramadan fast studies. We know that it's safe. We know that people kind of lose weight, but it's definitely different. So the two main differences, or three main differences, would be that, first of all, Ramadan fast is done during the day, whereas time-restricted eating, you fast during the night and you eat during the day. So Ramadan, you start fasting when the sun rises, and then you break your fast or you stop fasting whenever the sun sets. So during the day you're fasting, and then at night, basically you can start eating. So that's kind of the opposite. During intermittent fasting, you fast during the night, and then around, I don't know, noon, you start eating, you eat during the day, and around 7 or 8, you stop eating. And then, so it's like when you eat is kind of the opposite. Also, Ramadan fast is a dry fast, so people don't consume any water. So that's also different from, so there's, during the fasting hours, you're not allowed to drink water. Whereas in intermittent fasting or time-restricted eating, you are definitely allowed and encouraged to drink water. And also with Ramadan fast, whenever you break your fast at around, well, depends on where you are, but around like 8 or 9 p.m., you usually break your fast with a feast. That's called iftar. So it's like a real feast. So you get together with other families, you eat a lot of different foods, and it's like a celebration. And that's also different from your regular intermittent fasting, where you break your fast with just a regular meal. That's not necessarily like a big feast. So they're different, but at the same time, it's similar. So in a way that you're prolonging the amount of hours that you usually fast. And the results of Ramadan fast are surprisingly good. Even though people are feasting and eating a lot whenever they break their fast, they still lose weight. Some of their metabolic markers improve as well. So that's a lot of the data comes from those studies. Our data come from those.
So they're still in a caloric deficit, even though they're feasting.
Exactly.
Huh, interesting.
Yeah, and I would just interject that culturally, the foods they eat are probably significantly better than American foods. So, yeah, if we were to do that here in this country, people would be going to McDonald's at 9 o'clock and not Burger King. But culturally, I think they really, do well on their dietary practices too. So
yeah, they kind of align with like the Mediterranean diet standards, which are definitely one of the healthiest ones. Yeah, in America it would be completely different. Right?
Now, in terms of the benefits, the health benefits of intermittent fasting or fasting, compare it to chronic caloric restriction, so with calories equated, and also I don't know if it's the data if protein is also equated. If the health benefits are related to just the loss of body weight, because you lose weight, and if you lose weight, even from just exercise, all the metabolic markers improve. So is it just the fact that you're losing weight that confers the health benefits, and it has nothing to do with the technique of intermittent fasting, chronic caloric restriction, Ramadan fasting, whatever? So what do you think?
Oh, that's another really, really difficult question. That's actually the big question in fasting. Is it that fasting is just another strategy to make you lose weight, and because of the weight loss you see all the benefits, or is it something else? It depends on who you ask, honestly. If you're asking me, I would say 90% of the benefits of fasting is because of the weight loss. Yeah. So it's another strategy to achieve a caloric restriction and negative energy balance, weight loss. There's been, and it's really difficult to study this, because in order to try to assess if it's the weight loss or it's something else, you need to design sort of like a weight neutral study where people don't lose weight while they fast, and that's really challenging to achieve. There's been some tiny studies, short term, with very few people, but very well controlled studies that have tried to see like and measure this, and they've actually seen some improvements in the absence of weight loss. So two groups, one of the groups fast, the other group is not fasting, is doing a calorie restriction, but those two groups sort of not exactly a calorie restriction, but they're changing their diet, but they're maintaining their weight, like weight neutral. They're not achieving any weight loss. And the fasting group has improved some metabolic markers, decreased insulin markers, specifically related to insulin and glucoregulatory markers. But those are tiny studies, not a lot of people. So I wouldn't say too much about it. So
right. Well, I want you to speculate a little. Is it, if you were to guess, so you have people fast, but they're not losing weight. Would it be better to shift those calories to the morning versus the night? And why?
Okay.
Or it doesn't matter?
You're asking me really difficult questions because it depends. In my opinion, in the perfect world, shift those calories to earlier in the day. So like Tony said, when you eat earlier in the day and you stop eating earlier in the day, definitely you, at least from my point of view and from my kind of opinion now, it's better when you do it earlier in the day. Now, adherence is a big problem. It's difficult for people to do that. It's really challenging, especially considering that most people have their family meals at night. So the time where you can spend with your wife, your kids, whatever, it's usually at dinner. So telling people to skip that meal is really difficult. So if you tell them to eat really early, you might run the risk of them actually not doing it. So in a perfect world, earlier, in a real world, whatever they're able to adhere to, honestly. Yeah.
So assuming, Tony, before you ask the question, assuming caloric deficit is the same, whether it's, I decide to eat less, smaller breakfast, smaller lunch, smaller dinner, or I decide to narrow the window of feeding, but the caloric restriction's the same. I assume weight loss is the same, fat loss is the same. Yes, no, maybe so.
It's the same, and we've measured it. It's the same. We've like the latest 2 or 3 trials that we've run has been comparing intermittent fasting with a calorie restriction. We've done using an 8-hour window. So you eat during 8 hours and you fast for 16 hours. The calorie restriction group restricts 25% of their energy needs, and the results are basically the same. So you achieve the same results in terms of body weight and cardiometabolic benefits if you're fasting for 16 hours versus if you're restricting 25% of your energy needs. You can read that as okay, fasting is useless, but you can also read that as fasting is another tool to achieve a calorie restriction without having to make people measure what they eat. And there's some people that are really good at tracking calories, right? Probably the people that you guys work with, athletes, are really good at tracking macros and using apps and measuring. But the population that I work with, it's usually people with metabolic diseases, prediabetes, diabetes, they're really bad at that. So if you can offer people a strategy where they don't have to measure, they don't have to track, they just have to look at the watch and eat on less hours, and basically they can eat whatever they want to eat. That's usually how we do it in our studies. They achieve the same results. That's, at least from my perspective, it's really interesting and amazing. Now, that's with an 8-hour window. If you shorten the eating window even further, the results could be better. We haven't tested that, but they could be better.
Tony, did you have a question?
Yeah, it moves off the current a little bit, but so we're getting to the understanding that this practice is really good in weight management, weight control, perhaps decreasing body fat. There are a lot of, Dr. Sofia, a lot of other claims that are a bit extravagant too, that in terms of fasting, and I don't want to go way out of bounds here, but I'm talking about all the various hormone releases, or this hormone is mitigated if you fast, this hormone is increased, testosterone is increased if you fast. I mean, from an evolutionary biology perspective, we would expect that the body had learned to adapt, probably at various times, to not having food for sustained periods of time. We didn't have DoorDash and supermarkets, so it wasn't as plentiful. But I guess one thing that is being for sure brought out to us, hey, it's a great tool in weight management. But some of the other claims, are there any things that are happening? Like I said, release of this hormone, the mitigation of that one, anything. I've even read things on why it's so much better for neuroplasticity. And I don't know if any of that's true, but I don't want to go way off topic, but is any of it potentially even true?
Yeah, so actually another also great question. So the problem with the research in fasting is that most of the research in fasting comes from studies done in animal models.
Okay.
And many of those results come from studies done in animal models, specifically mice. So the thing is, yes, when you make mice fast for specific periods of time, you see some really amazing results. Have we been able to replicate that in humans? No. Have we measured the exact same things in humans? No. And the length, so if you make a rat or a mice fast for 8 hours, that's not the same as making or 16 hours. It's not the same as making a human fast for 16 hours. Because a mice or a rat will die of starvation at around like 48 hours or a little bit more. So it's as you would fast for like weeks. So the data is not really well translated from animals to humans. And that's the biggest mistake that I usually see, like in social media and things, that people take the claims from animal studies or even like cell culture studies, and they like extrapolate them to humans directly. And that's actually a big mistake, because those are things that we haven't seen in humans. Now, every day we get more studies done in fasting, but most of those studies are really, really tiny studies. And some of those results, like neuroplasticity, or wow, we saw some decreases in IGF, or those are like tiny sporadic studies, and none of those results have been consistently seen in big, well done studies. So the only results that we've seen like consistently repeating in like bigger, longer term studies are benefits in weight, in insulin markers, it's some other cardiometabolic markers, some oxidative stress markers, but that's basically it. We haven't seen other like super interesting results replicated in big studies, not really. Maybe in a couple of years, but this might change, maybe. But yeah, so the only results that we've seen consistently happening are the ones that I just mentioned.
Yeah, and just cool. I mean, that's a fantastic info. I didn't know that the duration was I knew mice couldn't go too long, but 48 hours is not that long without food.
I'm not 100% sure it's 48, but it's somewhere around 48.
Short.
It's like pretty short. So it's not the same. Yeah.
Well, I want to add another sidebar discussion to this. Way back when I started looking at chronic caloric restriction data, just sort of for fun, because it's not my field, but in many animal models or non-human models, if you calorically restrict, people live longer. So I want you to speculate on the chronic caloric restriction data in animals. Does it translate to humans? I imagine, I don't know if there's human studies ongoing. I would imagine that's hard to do, because what's the clinical endpoint? Death. I mean, we need to see how long people live. And is living longer in those animal models partly because the environment is controlled? I mean, I used to do a lot of animal work for my PhD, and people don't realize how clean the areas where they house animals. People think, oh, it's dirty. I'm like, it's cleaner than where people are, because they have to keep it pristine. Animals cost a lot. You want them healthy. So I've never thought chronic caloric restriction improved longevity outside of the fact that you weigh less. But I could be wrong. It's just my guess. This isn't my field, but just as someone who reads this stuff, it's like, wow, that's kind of interesting. If I eat less, I'll live longer, but maybe I'll be miserable. So I want to eat. But anyways, speculate a little bit on that and its effect on lifespan.
Yeah, so exactly. From animal studies, we've seen that a chronic calorie restriction or even fasting chronically increases lifespan. Like you said, the environments tightly, highly controlled environments of animals, it's impossible to replicate that in humans. Impossible. All of our studies are in free living conditions. And again, it's really difficult to design a study to see if people live longer. It has to be like a really long cohort study, observational, like a different methodology. But actually, like observational data coming from, like, probably you guys have heard of the blue zones.
Yes.
Okinawas, all of these areas in the world where the highest density of like centenarians are. One of the things that they all have in common is that they live on a slight calorie restriction. And I think that's pretty significant. Like if you study those populations where you see people that live past 100, 110 years old, and you measure their diets and you know that they're consistently eating a little bit less. It's not a significant calorie restriction, but it's around like 15%, 20% less calories than they require. They live longer. We don't know if it's exactly that or the many other things that centenarians do, but I think it could be related. So there's many hypotheses behind that. Is it because you're weighing less food, less oxidative stress, less mitochondrial stress, less other things? Honestly, I don't know what it could be, but I do believe that living on a slight calorie deficit can prolong lifespan. Why? I don't know that yet, but probably in a few years we might.
Well, let me ask you sort of oh, I'm sorry, Tony.
No, just one quick thing, but that deficit is also I believe, in most of those areas facilitated by being physically active, if not exercising, so I think in concert, those two working together probably really help, if I'm right there.
Yeah, exactly. So they're all physically active. They're all living on places where there's like altitude, so they have to walk uphill every day, 3 times a day. So there's many other confounders that could be. We don't know which one it might be, but they're on a slight calorie deficit. It could be because of the exercise.
Now, this is a fun conversation. I know Tony and our focus really is we get people who exercise train and they want to be either stronger, they want to be faster, have more endurance, have better body comp. So we really don't touch on, hey, do you want to live longer? Because if you ask an athlete if they want to live longer, they're like, what's that got to do? I just want to win. So this is more of a speculative question to see where Sofia is. If your goal, let's say your goal is you want to live as long as possible. Okay, that's your goal. What would you do? That is your goal, yeah. What would you do diet-wise and activity-wise if your goal is just to live as long as possible? I know Tony says he needs to lose weight, as do I.
Yeah,
we're too heavy.
No. I would say that if I wanted to live the longest I could, so people might disagree with me, but I definitely think that eating, of course, a healthy diet, fruits, vegetables, hopefully not a lot of animals. I don't know if you might agree with me here or not. Because
so that's like you'll be in a slight caloric deficit, sounds like.
So a slight calorie deficit. You still have to watch your protein. Lots of fruits and vegetables because you need those antioxidants mainly and vitamins and minerals. And in terms of physical activity, of course, I'm not an expert on physical activity, but I do believe that people who are extremely, extremely active, like endurance athletes, like long distance runners, I feel like those types of sports too oxidative. So I would say like resistance train, make sure that you have enough muscle mass, be active, but not severely active, because severely active, I think it could be doing the opposite and it's gonna probably make you live a little bit less than more. So I think it needs to be like in a fine balance. But I would say that mainly preserving your muscle mass, doing resistance training, making sure your bone density is okay, are key to like longevity. So that would be my take. This is not my area of research, but
it's a good take. It's a good take.
I'm agreeing with it wholeheartedly. I think high intensity training from an athletic performance standpoint is not going to be beneficial at all. I mean, volitional activity, first, I think it's very important that if you're being physically active, you somewhat enjoy that activity, not just pushing through it because you have to torture yourself to excel. And volitional activity in my studies too, in animal studies, seems to be best. But yeah, everybody I know it's anecdotal. My family wants to die at 90 and lives to 100, but nobody ever worked out. All they did was everything exactly what you're saying, Sophia. Nice diet. You know, they probably ate a little more animal protein than you do, but always active, lots of fruits and vegetables, no fake food, and probably walked at least an hour to 2 hours per day.
That's for me, that's perfect.
I believe that is myself.
That's perfect. What do you think?
Oh, I think I would agree with the slight caloric deficit just to keep body weight down. It's interesting you mentioned when you do extreme volumes of cardiovascular exercise. I know people who have had issues with their heart. I mean, your heart is a muscle, who have had to have multiple surgeries, atrial ablation. There's an MD Ph.D. out of Canada who he himself said, you know what, doing these long distance races, it may not be good for your heart. I mean, it's humans. I mean, evolutionarily, humans aren't meant to run at a very high capacity for long periods of time. They're really, when people are like, well, prehistorically, you had to hunt. I'm like, but they trotted. Humans didn't run fast. They would trot. And eventually the animal they were chasing would get tired because humans have a great aerobic capacity, second only to dogs and horses, although some people say, no, humans are better than horses. I'm like, I think dogs number one, horses number two, humans number three. So I agree with that. The resistance training part, maintaining bone mineral density, et cetera, et cetera. But what's interesting is people who do live long, they don't do hardcore exercise. They just move. Yeah, they just move. You know, it's so when Tony's squatting, it's like, Tony, that's not helping you live longer. When I do paddling races, I'm like, I know this isn't helping me live longer, but I like doing it. So, you know, it's sort of who I am. And Tony, hey, Tony's one of the few people at our age who can still do sprints. So that's something I think that will help.
But it makes me happy. And I honestly believe that if you're enjoying that activity, the effects are completely different than forced physical strain, right?
Exactly. I completely agree with
that. Okay. We're running out of time, but there's one very specific question and one general question I wanted to ask. The general question is this: any potential drawbacks to intermittent fasting? But I want to get to the specific question first. And it has to do with, you published a really elegant study. It was in Cell Metabolism, the title of it, so people could look it up. Effects of 4 and 6 hour time restricted feeding on weight and cardiometabolic health. A randomized controlled trial in adults with obesity. And what caught my eye, and actually you had mentioned this in a webinar that you gave, I'll be exact, it's on figure 4 looking at body composition, and you're comparing 4-hour TRF, 6-hour TRF, and the control, and the 6-hour time restricted feeding or fasting lost lean mass compared to the 4-hour and the control. So what say you?
it's definitely a tough one. So something that I usually say about fasting is that if you're not mindful of your protein intake, just like with any other kind of restrictive pattern, you run the risk of losing a little bit more lean mass. Just like with calorie restriction, if you don't watch the amount of protein that you're consuming, you can lose lean mass.
Right.
Now, we would have expected in that case to see more lean mass loss in the more restricted group, that's the 4-hour, but actually we saw that in the 6-hour. So we thought about it, possible ideas. We looked at their food records. Maybe they were eating less proteins. Maybe no, nothing was significantly different. So we're not completely sure why that happened. It could have been a measurement error. It could have been DEXAs. Even though DEXAs are really good for measuring body composition, we run into a very big problem with DEXAs. And that is that DEXAs are not well fitted for people with obesity. The books. So do you work with DEXAs?
Yeah, we've done, but we DEXA athletes, so we don't really deal with obese population.
So if you think of the DEXA box, an athlete fits.
Yeah.
But if you think of someone with a BMI of 38, it's more difficult. So there's usually parts of their bodies that we cannot measure very well. So we have our strategies to try to do it, like replicate the positioning, pre and post trial, all of that. But there's also, there might be a little bit of error in there. So it could be that. So we honestly don't have a clear explanation. And that's something that it's kind of frustrating for us in terms of the DEXAs. We wish there were DEXAs that were bigger, that we can use for measuring people with larger body sizes. But I don't know if you have any other hypotheses or theories about it.
No, I don't, because I remember when you went over it, I'm like, wow, I can't explain this. I actually have no idea. And I think the most reasonable one is just measurement error, because you're dealing with bodies that the DEXA is good, but it, like you said, there are limitations to it.
Limitations, unfortunately. And MRIs, and there's
because it wouldn't indicate anything that's behaviorally different. It wouldn't indicate anything in activity, or as you mentioned earlier, having more discipline. Or I'm trying to go to a lot of different places, and at least at the moment, I can't figure anything out. But
it's complex.
Yeah. But fascinating. Anyway, I mean, again, still the good news is an effective method for weight loss. That's all that really matters at the point, right? So
it is. And I always say, watch your protein and make sure that you're resistance training or any type of training. Because again, if you don't watch your protein and you don't do any physical activity, you definitely run the risk of losing muscle mass. Yes.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Okay, one final question. Drawbacks of intermittent fasting. What are the pros and cons? And also, is there a difference in the psychology of it? Meaning people who do caloric restriction, chronic caloric restriction versus, I think I'll do IF instead. Is there something going on there?
So we haven't measured that exactly, but usually what we say is that people that cannot restrict calories every day, that don't have the discipline, or that don't want to change what they eat, they don't want to like select specific foods, intermittent fasting is a really easy and like interesting strategy for them. Drawbacks, so like I said, potential losses in muscle mass. Actually, in terms of hormones, reproductive hormones, what we've seen is that testosterone tends to decrease more than increasing.
Male and female?
Male and female. In males, the studies that have seen decreases in testosterone is not a very clinically significant decrease in testosterone, and also no significant effects on like endurance and strength, and other markers are also related to testosterone. Nothing. So I wouldn't say it's clinically significant. However, for females, it is clinically significant, but it's actually something that's more positive, because among females, there's some specific diseases that are caused because of an excess testosterone. And actually the trial that we're running now, it's among females with PCOS, so polycystic ovary syndrome. That's a specific condition where females have excess testosterone, and fasting can be specifically helpful on that condition. But for males that are specifically trying to increase muscle mass, I wouldn't say that fasting is the best strategy, honestly. I would say there are other strategies. If you're trying to decrease your body weight in general, if you're trying to cut, fasting could be a good strategy. But for bulking or gaining muscle mass, fasting is not the best strategy, at least from my point of view. There are some risks on specific like life stages or pregnancy, breastfeeding. We're not really sure. We don't have any data, so we usually advise against it. People with a history of eating disorders, we usually also advise against it. So I think that would be the main drawbacks of intermittent fasting. I think I'm missing something from your question. Is there something?
Oh, no, that was it. Drawbacks. The other one was the psychological effects. I mean, if there if there is anything specific to intermittent fasting psychologically, but I think you had mentioned it. It's just easier for some people to restrict calories that way versus, oh my God, I got to eat less at breakfast, lunch, and dinner. This will be, horrid.
Yeah, and something psychological though that's interesting about fasting is that usually whenever people start fasting, like consciously fasting, like for instance, the study that we're running now, I just met with a couple of my participants that they have to start eating at 1 and they stop eating at 7. So they're doing a 6-hour window. So this is the study for females with PCOS. The first week is awful. They hate it the first week because you are changing your normal eating schedule and your body always reacts, always. Yeah. So the first week is like awful and people usually feel tired and grumpy, but it's really interesting that in almost all of our studies, what we've seen is that those that are able to stick to it the first week, the second week is way easier, and the third week, they don't even remember that they're fasting. They like get used to it like immediately. Like the body readjusts to the new like eating schedule really, really well. So
is this with or without exercise?
So no, we're not making them exercise anything in particular because we're isolating the effect of fasting, but we do give them like Fitbits, so we track their activity to see at the end if there were any significant differences, but we're not making them exercise in this study.
Well, this has been a fun conversation, Sofia. Tony, you have any final words?
I'm just really glad we had it because I've learned a lot. Really, it's fantastic, Sofia. It's great to get some real clear answers from a great scientist that dedicates her life to this, as opposed to just scrolling around and hearing all kinds of crazy information. But really informative, and thank you, because I love walking away learning, and I certainly did. This was great.
Where can people find, if you're giving a talk at a conference, typically where would you go? People are more interested in what you do.
So I have an Instagram account, but the problem is a lot of that is in Spanish.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, so it could be my Instagram account. I'm also on Twitter, but very little. And I'm also on YouTube. So yeah, probably there you guys can email me like
your Instagram is your name, or
my name in Instagram is Sofia, Sofia 100, because my last name is Cienfuegos and Cien is.
I got it. Yep, I found you. Wow, look at this, 120,000 folks following. That's a big deal.
That was honestly, I'm not that active anymore because I'm too busy. But during the pandemic, when all of our studies were shut, I became active on social media, and now I'm like
yeah, there seems to be a relationship between how active you are as a scientist and how inactive you are on Instagram. Because there are some scientists I'm like, how do you get all these followers? Oh, that's right, you're not doing any studies.
So when I wasn't doing any studies, that's when I got all the followers.
That's great.
All right. Well, hey, thank you so much, Sofia, for being on the Sports Science Dudes. Hopefully we'll get this thing posted tomorrow, but we learned a hell of a lot, and keep up the great work. It's super interesting stuff. And again, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. And if you have any questions, anything, please reach out. I'll be happy to continue discussing or answering any questions that you have. So thank you so much. This was super fun.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.